All right, welcome everyone to today's webinar. This is Michael Revere. I work at the Salem Police Department in Salem, Massachusetts. And I want to first thank the National Immigrant Women's Advocacy Project, the Kansas Coalition, and the Kansas Law Enforcement Training Center for having us and making this webinar possible. This webinar is supported by the Office of Violence Against Women. Both NUAP and the Kansas Coalition have grants to support this project. And I'm going to turn it over to Shelley and Wendy to say a little bit about themselves.
Hello, my name is Shelley Sonnenberg. I am a detective with the Boise Police Department here in Boise, Idaho. I've been in the department for 19 years now and spent a majority of my career working as the refugee liaison for the department.
Hi, my name is Wendy Lau. I'm the Program Manager of the Interpretation Technical Assistance Resource Center here at the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence. We are a comprehensive TA provider for the Office on Violence Against Women on language access issues, including language access planning, language access advocacy, and training for bilingual individuals for interpretation skills.
Thanks, Wendy and Shelley. And again, Michael Revere here. I work at the Salem Police Department. I also conduct national training on issues around domestic and sexual violence, specifically towards the immigrant populations. So our learning objectives today, by the end of this webinar, we want to make sure everybody understands how to improve your investigations by utilizing language access tools. We want to enhance victim safety and participation in the criminal justice system. We want to use language access to enhance officer, victim, and community safety. We want to improve our community policing in immigrant communities. In order to do this properly, you really need to pay attention to your demographics. And if you take a look at the Kansas demographics, you see you have a total foreign-born population of 205,522. 7% of the state's 3 million people are foreign-born, with 39.5% of that being naturalized citizens, 29.8% being lawful permanent residents or temporary status persons, 30.7% are undocumented. There's been a 52.5% rise in immigrant population between 2000 and 2016 in Kansas, and 16% of the children in the state under the age of 18 have one or more immigrant parents. 89.7% of those children with immigrant parents in the states are U.S. natives. When you look at the countries of origin in Kansas, we have Latin America representing 55%, which is broken down to Mexico 40.7, Central America 8.4, and South America 3.4. Asia represents 32.2%, with Vietnam 6%, India 5.7%, and China 4.1%. Europe represents 7%, Africa 3.7%, and as far as limited English proficiency, naturalized citizens are 37.6% and non-citizens 63%. So by looking at those two slides and that information, you can see how there's absolutely a need to properly address language access.
So the next few, okay. The next few slides are going to go over some more information about language access and why it's important as part of your work. Besides just doing the right thing and using an interpreter, the language access is embedded into civil rights law, where, as you can see in Title VI, language access is tied to national origin under a seminal case of Lau versus Nichols, where an individual who spoke only Chinese was not offered options in educational resources, and the Supreme Court then ruled that because of that, it was in violation of national origin, and that's the tie between language access and national origin. Other governance includes the Executive Order 13166 that was written by to designate that all agencies receiving federal financial assistance must provide meaningful access to limited English proficient individuals. This means that they have to develop, implement language access plans, and that any other government agencies that are funding organizations also provide guidance on how to ensure meaningful access. So meaningful access is the standard being used, and what exactly does it mean? It means that language assistance that results in accurate, timely, and effective communication at no cost to the limited English proficient individual. For limited English proficient individuals, this means that it doesn't significantly restrict, delay, or is inferior or compared to programs or activities provided to English proficient individuals. So we're looking at parity of services here. If a service is being offered to someone who's English speaking, that same level of service should be provided to someone who's limited English proficient. Somebody who has been waiting 2 hours for an interpreter to seek services, that's not providing meaningful access. Or if there's somebody not being a proper interpreter or interpretation is being summarized, that also means that there's no meaningful access, and that's in violation of the executive order. It could also mean violation of Title VI. One of the tools of providing meaningful access is interpretation, and you'll often hear that interpretation and translation being interused, but there is a difference. Interpretation is a conversion of spoken language spoken verbally, and we can see here that these characters here are using oral methods to communicate. Translation is the conversion of written text from one language to another. So there's a complete difference here. Translation is really talking about writing different things in another language and rendering it in another language. So you want to be sure that when you're requesting the right tool to provide meaningful access, that you're accurate in saying that you're requesting an interpreter or a translator too. Those are two very separate functions. Some individuals may only be certified in interpretation, and some individuals may only be certified in translation. It's not good to assume that an individual knows how to do both, so being sure to be specific in what you need as you're communicating with the limited English proficient individual. Another best practice when you're working with an interpreter is to be sure to use first person. And these are two examples here about how first person is being used. You're talking directly to the individual, to the limited English proficient individual through the interpreter, instead of using third person in this example where the officer to the interpreter is saying, can you ask the victim what happened? The interpreter would have to interpret, can you ask the victim what happened, which can be confusing to the victim. So you want to remain in first person, ignoring that the interpreter is there and talking directly to the limited English proficient individual. Another example of third person being used is when the interpreter is stepping out of role to clarify a question. So here we have the interpreter to the officer. The interpreter is not familiar with the acronym RICO. Could you please explain what it stands for so the interpreter can interpret correctly? This is an example where the interpreter is asking for clarification and therefore stepping out of the role and referring to themselves as the interpreter in order to make sure that things are being interpreted accurately and completely. The DOJ has also provided model guidance for law enforcement officers, and these are a few bullet points that list certain things in that guidance. The law enforcement will provide free language access to limited English proficient individuals who request it, who actually request for an interpreter or who need language assistant help, or when the officer decides it is helpful to a criminal investigation or prosecution. Sometimes a limited English proficient individual may not know they have the right to request it, may not know that it's free, and it's up to the officer to decide that it's important and imperative to get that interpreter in order to continue the investigation. It may be that the LEP person refuses an interpreter because of certain stigma that happens with requesting help. It's important for the officer to also know that they can also say that I need the interpreter because I need to continue my work in a way that's accurate completely and I'm not able to communicate with you. So the onus is on the English-speaking officer and not necessarily on the limited English proficient individual. Law enforcement should also inform members of the public that language assistance is available at free charge. This can be done by posters in the entryway, places and signs when they walk up to make a complaint or a report. There can be signs that are available that designate that free language access and free language assistance is available. Language access provided in person's primary language. So if an individual can designate that they are fluent in multiple languages, but they select one of the particular languages, the language should be provided in that language. It may be that many individuals speak English in a way that they communicate, but we know that when there are times of trauma, it may be very difficult to think about the events that happened in English, and they may want to revert to their primary language too, which is why even though many officers may be able to communicate with individuals who may have elementary English, it's important to ask what their primary language and what they're comfortable in communicating in and when making these reports or complaints. There's also on the Department of Justice website sample policies for city policeman departments on language access, and the Department of Justice approach to language access and steps for obtaining interpreters. And we can provide those links later in the Resource Center.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. It's really important. I mean, it's likely that a lot of this stuff is fairly new to the agencies that are hearing it, and it's really important to take advantage of the resources that are out there to assist with doing this. And New App and API also have some really good resources and some technical assistance they can provide to get through this process.
So Mike, let's talk a little bit. As first responders, what is it that we normally do when we arrive on?
Well, what we want to do first is just ensure the safety of everybody involved, including ourselves and anyone that's at that residence or that place that we're responding to. In short, we're trying to secure the scene. So we're looking to try to find out what's going on, who's involved, paying special attention to if there were any weapons that were involved, if somebody needs medical attention that's on scene. And then it kind of crosses to the point where now, like if maybe somebody fled the scene, you need to find out which way they went. Did they say were they heading somewhere? So you can, get the appropriate resources out there and available to try to locate that person. So again, in short, you're trying to secure the scene, and in doing that, you're doing these exigent things, these things that have to get done in order to secure the people involved, keep everybody safe, and then get that critical information necessary to address, like medical attention, weapons, and flight, and where the person might be fleeing to.
Yeah, so I would agree with all of that. As a first responder, we're supposed to go and secure the scene, make sure that nobody's injured, and if they are, to get them the appropriate help that's needed. Obviously, we want to identify the role players and find out where the victims, the witnesses, the suspects are, and oftentimes, as we know, we get there and the suspect's often gone. So getting that information as to where they were or where they are, if they have any weapons on them, again, going back to making sure that the scene is safe. That's our role as a first responder and the primary person responding to the scene. So what do we do when we arrive at a scene and there's limited English proficient individuals there? I mean, how is it that we get the information to secure the scene when there's a language barrier? You've heard 100 times, I know this, that we're not allowed to use children as an interpreter or to translate anything, which is absolutely true, unless there are exigent circumstances. If our primary job is to secure the scene and make sure everybody's safe, we need to find out that information as quickly as possible. So sometimes, on rare occasions, we are going to have to reach out and possibly speak to a child. We discourage it, but if it's the only thing that's possible, then that's what we have to do in order to make sure that we're doing our job properly. So we might use a temporary interpreter to assist, to try to get the immediate information. Where is the suspect? Where are the weapons? Are there any weapons? If anybody's hurt, we need to find out what those injuries are, and we're going to lean on the person who speaks English so we can make sure that the scene is safe. So Department of Justice requirements for investigations and interrogations. This is probably the only thing that I'm going to read word for word because it's important for law enforcement officers to understand. A qualified interpreter shall be used for any interrogation or taking of a formal statement where the suspect or witness's legal rights could be adversely impacted. So these aren't just interrogations, these are interviews, these are not only with victims and suspects, but with witnesses as well. It's very important that when we look at the Department of Justice in Title VI, that we're following the procedures that have been put in place for us because it can be very detrimental to the case later on. Oftentimes, especially, in Kansas, it looks like you have a pretty large Latin American population there. Consider translating some of the primary paperwork into Spanish. We have our Miranda warnings in Spanish here in Boise, Idaho. Mike, do you have anything that's translated in Salem?
Yes, we have 14 different languages translated right now. And Shelley, you bring up a good point, because one of the things that's important to note, and it's very intimidating when you start to learn about this requirement, you think, like a jurisdiction like mine, Salem, what are we going to do? We have, so much diversity, and we have so many people that come to our city as tourists from other countries and speak different languages. How are we going to cover all the bases? And we're not expected to have every single base covered to the point where no matter what language you may come across, you're going to have a face-to-face interpreter that's going to be able to assist you. We know, if we know there's certain demographics that are going to be present in our city, in our community, we address those. And then we have alternate types of resources that we can utilize. Say if it's somebody that comes into Salem who's visiting and might speak Hmong, and we don't have access to a Hmong interpreter, then we would use other resources like a language line, and we'd call that language line and let them know, the situation that we have at hand, and they would help us overcome that. So I think it's important to put that out there so you don't get off this webinar and all of a sudden think, oh my God, we have like 20 different languages just in this one area alone. How are we going to cover everything? As long as we're doing everything we can to try to address that and to be prepared, we're compliant with this requirement.
Yeah, and I try to use Title VI to put it in layman's terms for law enforcement. What we're supposed to be doing is providing equal and fair service to everybody, even if there's a language barrier there. So it's kind of upon us to find ways to communicate with the people who have limited English proficiency. So Mike's absolutely right. There's a lot of things that we can do, and hopefully as we talk through this webinar, we'll offer some suggestions that might work for you. So the positive thing is when you are using a qualified interpreter, there's some things that we can gain from this. Obviously, we are going to be able to identify the offender quickly. We'll have the safety of all involved taken care of. The admissible statements, excited utterances, the things that we use and the prosecutors love. If we don't have somebody who's qualified to actually interpret that, then our struggle in getting that put in at the time of trial is very, very difficult. More times than not, when we're not using a qualified interpreter, we have mistaken identity, we have misinterpretation. Again, if we are using the kids, there's additional problems that come with that, and just imagine a child who's involved in a domestic violence situation that has to explain what mommy said to daddy or daddy said to mommy. So keep those things in the back of your mind when you're actually dealing on the scene with somebody who's LEP. I just want to bring up this case. Just outside of our jurisdiction here in Boise, Idaho, unfortunately, we had a situation in 2008. Jose Meza was at home with his 3-week-old son. His wife was still in the hospital. He ends up getting frustrated, and he shakes the baby to the point that it ends up killing him. We had officers go out to the scene and bring him in. One of the detectives requested a Spanish-speaking officer to come in and assist with the interview, the investigation. And the Spanish-speaking officer, out of the goodness of his heart, goes in and attempts to assist the detective. And we'll talk about this a lot. When somebody says they speak Spanish, we all know that it's not always the same Spanish. In this situation, this was not a Spanish speaker that was from Mexico. And so Meza, when he was in the interview, said certain things, made comments about certain things, and unfortunately the officer who was assisting didn't pick up on all of that. So there were some misrepresentations once they actually sat down and a court-appointed interpreter actually went through and listened to the tape. This case, unfortunately, was dropped down from first-degree murder to manslaughter, and Mr. Meza is walking around in our community right now, basically due to the good heart of a detective trying to do the right thing but not doing the right thing. We were trying to get by and use detective who, or I'm sorry, an interpreter that we weren't paying for. They weren't certified, they weren't qualified, and it kind of came back and bit us in this case. So even when you're using a bilingual officer, please consider reaching out and finding that qualified interpreter to help with the investigation.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that case like that really demonstrates why it's so important to do this the right way, why we have, laws like this and the executive order that followed. And, none of us that do this work want to end up being the reason why someone like this, who deserves to really be held accountable way more than he did, ends up being convicted of a lesser charge. And we have to use qualified interpreters, and I think it's a normal practice around the country. I mean, I know my agency was doing it for a long time. I've spent a lot of years traveling around the country, training law enforcement on different types of investigations, and when we began bringing up Title VI and language access, it was almost across the board with the very unique situations where they said, oh yeah, we do this, to address language access or that, but most of the time we were using bilingual officers, and all of our colleagues were around the country, and that's just not compliant with this Title VI requirement. It's not doing it properly, and look what ends up happening when we don't. And it really brings me to the next question, Shelley. What do we do? So we've talked about securing the scene and those exigent circumstances, and that's great. We need to do that, and we need to be able to rely on the best, temporary person available that can at least give us that critical information. But what do we do once we have the scene secured and we're ready to move this response into the investigation mode?
Yeah, and I think what we need to do is step back and take a look and figure out what are our needs to complete this investigation and do it properly. At least here in Boise, once the exigency has passed, we call out a detective. We make sure that we've got paramedics there assisting. This is really the time that we need to start looking at the language barriers. And if we need to get somebody en route who can assist with the interviews, then that's the time that we reach out for that qualified interpreter to come and assist during the investigation portion of this. Obviously, we've got crime scene photos to take, and consider this. If you have somebody who's a limited English proficient individual and we're trying to take photos of their injuries, how intrusive that might be if the communication is lacking. It's really important to have somebody there to help the victim through the process and make sure that we are explaining everything to the best of our ability and providing that equal and fair service. So as we go through it, and without that interpreter, we might not be able to move on to what is our probable cause. How are you going to convince them to come to the station with you when they're a victim if you're not able to communicate with them? So at this time, we're doing whatever it takes to make sure that our investigation is getting completed in the best possible manner.
Very well said, Shelley. And so as everyone can see the process here, we get this call. We get a call. It's an emergency situation. There's been crimes committed. We respond. We can't communicate with this person because they're LEP. We do everything we can, utilizing the best interpreter available to secure the scene, get that exigent critical information. And now, as Shelley's brought us to, now we're talking about our investigation and developing probable cause and those arrest decisions, as well as responding, sending people who are there maybe to help, like, medical personnel, fire personnel, that type of thing. But we're developing probable cause now. And by law, by Title VI and the executive order, we are required to utilize qualified interpreters. And that's the big, big lesson in all of this. And, here in that case that you had, Shelley, in Boise, a horrible case. And ultimately, I think that you'll agree, it came down to the fact that we didn't have a qualified interpreter that was processing this information. And as a result of those differences between what was said and what was interpreted, you have a situation where you can't hold that person accountable. So with this investigation beginning, anytime you're taking initial statements, you're calling in detectives, you're developing your probable cause, make sure you do whatever you can to utilize a qualified interpreter. And if you don't have one on hand that you can contact that can get to the scene or get to the the barracks of the police station to do that. Utilize some of those secondary type resources like a language line where you could do it over the phone or through a video interpretation. Next slide. So how do we actually encounter victims of crime who are LEP? There's many different ways. You could get them through dispatch. You could get called to the station to handle something. You could actually be working inside the station as an inside person, whether civilian or sworn, but under the umbrella of that law enforcement agency, and have to take a report or gain information. You get called out to a crime scene. Like I said, a person walks into the station like it says here. Or maybe we get a referral from somebody like Elder Protective Services or Child Protective Services, any of those other service providers that are included in our community response may refer us to somebody, and we're conducting an investigation to determine what happened. And lastly, as you see here, any kind of criminal investigation that you're conducting. And again, just to revert back to the big message here, making sure that we utilize qualified interpreters anytime we've crossed that access point where it's not exigent and we've secured the scene and we've stepped forward to the point where we're starting to conduct an investigation. Shelley?
How does your investigation proceed with non-English speaking victims? For those of you that don't have a language line already accessible, it's a great opportunity for you to reach out to victims, suspects, witnesses who do have limited English proficiency. Here in Boise, one of the things that we use is a language line, not only for the officers out in the field, but also for the dispatchers that are receiving the calls that are coming in. When I go around and I speak to this particular issue around the nation, I'm finding more and more that dispatchers are oftentimes not giving the resources that they need in dealing with these situations. So I really would encourage you, if you don't have something already set up, to look into a language line program. It's very, very helpful. A little tedious in the sense that you're using a phone, one person says something, another person says something, and they're not there. However, in the spirit of Title VI, if that's the only thing you have, then that's what we've got to use. So I would encourage all of you to look into the language line. Obviously, there's also video remote interpretations, there's video relay interpretations. My particular department, because we have such a high refugee population here in Boise, we have over 100 different languages being spoken in our schools and our homes. So we took it upon ourselves to create an interpreter program which deals primarily with the languages that are living here in the Boise area. So with that, they actually work for us. And we call them out to scenes when needed. They have a signed contract, have a completed background check. Not everybody has the ability to do that, but just because of our needs here in our small community, that's how we decided to kind of attack that problem. There's obviously an immigrant community-based organizations. We've got them here in Boise. We have a large Hispanic population, and we work with the Hispanic Cultural Center and have found interpreters that are qualified and certified through that organization. And just remember, all of the hospitals, they are required per Title VI to provide that same equal and fair service. The school systems, anybody receiving federal government money, those requirements aren't any different. So we've tapped into our schools, especially those that have to do parent-teacher conferences, and to the medical organizations around the city.
Just so one thing about video remote and video relay. So video remote interpretation is becoming very popular. because you can see the person. Language Line from AT&T is now offering that service where you can look at the individual who you're talking with and with the interpreter too. And then video relay interpretation is really important that most states have when you're communicating with somebody who may be using sign language or maybe deaf and hard of hearing. Most states have a public access line because video relay is backed by the federal FCC laws too. So if you look at Kansas and the line, it's usually like a 701 or a 411 line that can connect you to a video relay so you can talk to somebody or call somebody who is deaf or hard of hearing, and they're able to communicate in that way. Another tool that's been very popular is the VITA tool from the UN, and the VITA tool was created where you use audio messages, and an officer chooses an object like a red pen or a black pen to indicate yes or no, and the questions go through very basic things like do you need help, do you need an interpreter, and then the individual can point to the red pen for yes or the black pen for no in front of a potential John who's there and indicate what they're answering to. So it's a platform that's being used where the individual can also look at a map and point to the country and also point to the language they need to, and then those questions will pop up visually, so and as well as audibly, so they can see the question being said in their language as well as hear it if you have headphones that you connect to it. Right now, this tool is still being funded, so the PDF is being out and the map is out to see, but the actual tool itself right now is still being developed by the UN, but we hope to get more updates on that moving forward.
So we talked a little bit about this in the case out of the Boise area, but using bilingual officers versus interpreters, I think that the most important thing to take away from this is as an officer, if you are interpreting, there becomes a point where you are actually investigating the case versus interpreting for the primary officer. We already know the questions to ask as officers, so what happens, unless you are verbatim repeating the question back and forth between the detective and the suspect, you are interpreting at that point. But what happens is when the suspect gives information and you want to follow up with that, you oftentimes take over as the investigator. And we need to remember we need to separate that. Personally, I feel it's more appropriate to call in a qualified interpreter and ask them to assist in this area than to ask the bilingual officer to take over the investigation. I just think that it's cleaner. I think the prosecutors like it. Obviously, the judges like it. So just consider, in those exigent circumstances, bilingual officers are great. But once we turn this into an investigation, let's make sure that we're doing it right. The other issue is the biculturalism versus bilingualism. Well, as you guys can see, sometimes I need an interpreter for Mike. So it doesn't necessarily need to be from another country. It can be from the other side of the country, and there's difficulty understanding some of the words coming out of their mouth. Mike, you know, he's got an accent. It's hard for me sometimes to understand him. Well, imagine if the word itself is actually, it means something different. So be cognizant of that. Remember that there's a lot of differences in these other countries, specifically with the refugee communities. We're asking them questions about things that probably don't even exist in their home country. So having that, that person there who can interpret word for word and have it mean what we want it to mean. I've oftentimes been in an interview and gone to the point where I'm explaining what domestic battery is, and I actually hear the domestic battery words being spoken as they're interpreting. That tells me that that's not being translated or interpreted properly, and that perhaps I need to explain what domestic battery means versus just saying the words. So be cognizant of that. It's something that I think is oftentimes overlooked.
Yeah, another thing too, Shelley, is really just to make sure everybody understands, and I appreciate how you really took it to the next level with the exigent circumstances, and really pointing out that it's the best temporary person available. So if you have a bilingual officer that's on scene, even during that exigent circumstances portion of this response, you want to use that bilingual officer over the neighbor that might be there versus the child that might be there. But just to be really clear about when you cross that line and now you're investigating, you're taking statements, you're doing the things that we do as responders and investigators, it's not appropriate at any time to utilize a bilingual officer. You would be going against the requirement of Title VI in the executive order, and that would open up your agency and your community or city or town up to the actions that the DOJ could bring forward. So you want to make sure anytime that you've crossed that line and you're conducting the investigation, taking statements, developing probable cause, that you utilize a qualified interpreter one way or another. And that's why we'll talk about some of the things that could be available to you and these secondary resources that may be out there.
So some tips for working with interpreters, and whether it be telephonic interpreters or in-person interpreter, you as the officer, you can control the interview. So you can dictate, lay out your expectations that interpreters should be interpreting everything accurately and completely. Also letting them know in a pre-session what the hand signals may be. If you're, so the interpreter knows, they can signal to you when things are going too fast or needs a break, as well as in that pre-session asking the individual where they might be located, especially for telephonic interpretation. This is because even though you may think that your interpreter is in Maine and you're in Kansas, it may be that they won't know each other, but many refugee communities are very small. So even if there's somebody located in Maine, they may know that person who's on the other phone with you too. So being aware that that issue may come up even in a telephonic situation too. You also want to make sure that they don't know the individual who they're interpreting for, just to flag any issues of bias, or that may also shut down somebody who's a victim who may not want to detail what's going on if they know the other person who's the interpreter knows them or knows their family as well. The interpreter has to interpret everything you say. So if you have any indication, and many of you have had this before, where you're working with an interpreter and an LAP individual, the LAP individual has been talking for about 2 minutes, and then the interpreter turns around and says, well, one word, like no. You know at that point the interpreter's probably summarized something and left out something in that questioning. And you want to remind that interpreter that they have to interpret everything and not just summarize. Because summarization means that that interpreter is taking the discretion to decide what's important. And you as the officer, you're the one who knows what's important. And you know the details that are needed in order to file your report or to make any cases too. So remind the interpreter. Also, I've talked to some officers who feel like they feel odd about ending the interpretation or questioning the interpreter. The interpreter is there to help you make sure that you do your job correctly and as best as possible. So if you have an indication that the interpreter is not interpreting everything correctly or summarizing, maybe the victim is shutting down because the interpreter is not doing their job, you can always hang up the phone or ask for a new interpreter and ask for a new interpreter to come on to interpret the rest of your time with this limited English proficient individual. When you're explaining confidentiality, it's also important that when you're talking to the LAP individual, that interpreter is interpreting everything to the victim, and then also whatever the victim says, they're interpreting it back to you. That's just so that confidentiality is being understood by all parties. So, and also maybe not just asking yes or no if the LAP victim understands, but asking a very broader question if they have any questions, or if they have, you can ask them about specific details about confidentiality so that the individual, the victim, LAP victim knows what's going on when you're explaining confidentiality.
Yeah, and I think that what I would add to that, again, as law enforcement officers, the concept and the terminology that we use maybe isn't always understood by other cultures. So look for those American words in the midst of the interpretation. I hear it all the time with child abuse, domestic violence, or domestic battery, or what we often do is DUI. And not explaining exactly what DUI is or what domestic battery or violence looks like. So be aware that sometimes if the word isn't translating in the proper manner, that we might need to do a little bit more of an explanation. So we're making sure that the victim or the witness understands. Other considerations, I would say, obviously we normally separate parties, but it's especially important when we're dealing with LEP individuals. Obviously, we can't understand the language that they're speaking, or we would most likely just be speaking to them in that language. So we don't understand what's going on between the two of them. Culturally, even though I worked with refugee communities for 9 years, I still couldn't tell you what every single culture is all about. So we need to be aware that they might be threatening the person, they might be, the gestures that they make might mean something different to us here in the U.S. So the best way to do it, separate them, get them alone so they feel safe. The other thing I would suggest is, you know, consider a matriarchal or patriarchal community. Is it going to hurt me to go and speak to the male first rather than the female if I know that that's a community that there's a high respect for men? I really think as law enforcement officers, we're not changing the way we're doing things. We're adapting to the situation that we're in. So be aware of those things, and if we can make it easier on that situation and that family, then I would encourage you to consider those things. In Boise, we don't have headsets, but I know that a lot of agencies are moving to that, so they don't have to worry about the background noise when they're actually dealing with an interpreter. That there's some of the distractions are taken away by using the headsets. Otherwise, here in Boise, we use our cell phones, put it on speakerphone, and conduct the interview that way.
In some cases, sometimes you may not be able to find an interpreter in the primary language of the LEP individual, but that LEP individual may speak other languages that you can find another interpreter for. For example, many individuals may know, in countries that were formerly colonized, may know their native language and French, or their native language and Dutch too, so they may have that option. In some cases, and this may happen with many individuals who use another form of sign language that's not the American Sign Language, you may have to go through multiple interpreters. And this is kind of the process here that shows what would happen. So let's say that you had a deaf Japanese client using Japanese Sign Language. Then you would also need to get a Japanese interpreter. So the Japanese Sign Language interpreter, the deaf Japanese client signs to the Japanese Sign Language interpreter, who then interprets in Japanese, and then you get a Japanese to English speaking interpreter that speaks into English too. So there is this process that does take a longer period of time, but may be necessary too when you can't find someone who's going to necessarily be able to interpret straight from deaf Japanese Sign Language right into English.
So I guess some of the red flags that we'll talk about is pretty obvious when you can step back and look at it. What happens is when we get in the midst of things, we might not be recognizing some of the red flags. So do you understand the interpreter? A lot of times with the accents, it's difficult because many of our interpreters here in Boise speak multiple languages. So the most important thing is be able to understand what the interpreter is saying. We also need to make sure that the LEP individual is understanding what the interpreter is saying. So, for example, I have some refugees that are from the Congo, and I have a French interpreter from Canada. Sometimes the dialect alone is very difficult for the Congolese to understand. So I need to make sure that I'm aware that what I'm trying to convey is getting through, and vice versa. So just be aware and make sure that you're paying attention to the LEP. It's obvious that there's some difficulty in misunderstanding when it's occurring. The other thing
you really need to be aware, Shelley. Just like you're saying, just really being aware. And I tell you, I've had some, you know, in hindsight, looking back at some of the experiences I've had with some real serious investigations and utilizing a bilingual officer, and I would ask a question about a serious crime that occurred and trying to get a timeline about what happened before, leading up to that crime, before they got, say, to the residence. And I can specifically remember one instance where I asked the bilingual officer, I asked a question through the bilingual officer, and the victim responded with like a 2 to 3 minute conversation. And then he just turned to me and he basically said, yeah, they stopped at a restaurant to get something to eat, which obviously there was a whole lot more going on. So anytime you have that kind of stuff, pay attention to this summarizing. It's one of the things that non-qualified interpreters and even qualified interpreters sometimes do, being aware of that. And I like the stuff it has on the slide. It talks about the interpreter being confused. So maybe you ask a question and they're looking at you like, I'm not really sure how to answer that. And then they kind of start to say some words in between your questions. And I've had this experience as well. In between questions, I've had the interpreter actually have a conversation on the side with the victim, or almost like consoling the victim or saying they're doing a good job. And even recently I had a situation where during a pause in my questioning, and I was investigating a serious incident that happened here in my community, and I had all my questions and I had those questions answered, but based on the answers, as everyone knows, you have follow-on questions. So I took a pause for about 15, 20 seconds to gather my eggs together and figure out what my follow-on questions were. And during that time frame, the interpreter that I had on the phone, the over-the-phone language line interpreter, started making comments about the case, basically saying, she needs to be safe tonight. He could kill her if he finds her. And although you may think, she's speaking in English to you, so the victim doesn't understand. Well, this victim actually was fairly well at picking up on different things of the English language, but her primary language is Mandarin, and I couldn't have an actual conversation and do this statement correctly, trying to, pass through this in English, but she certainly could understand different phrases and different words of the English language, and it really had a negative impact on my case.
So following up to that, it's important to, when you're working with telephonic interpretation companies, to really remember their ID number, write it down, and so when you go back to maybe renegotiate your contract, you can point out to that point of contact, like these are the number of times that bad instances happened where the interpreter was having side conversations, or I couldn't connect to somebody, so they can also really reevaluate that, and also letting your peers know a certain ID number, that interpreter won't be a good use of time, and that they should request a new one if that ID number comes up too. Interpreters will bring dictionaries, so that's not necessarily a red flag. A good interpreter will always bring a dictionary, will always take notes. They can shred those notes. Maybe there's confidentiality issues. You may need to shred those notes, so being aware of what's being written down at the time. You really want to make sure the interpreter is comfortable with the subject matter of the case, especially if you're working in the realm of domestic violence and sexual assault, where there will be certain terms, and making sure that the interpreter is being accurate to each term, understands the slang that's being used and the context as well. Many interpreters that you may have skills in biotechnology or interpreting in different manufacturing industries. That might not be as helpful to you if you're doing a client interview or investigation where somebody has been abused or there has been violence that has occurred. Addressing cultural experiences ahead of time. So interpreters are not cultural navigators. They're not there to do any cultural explanation. So just be sure to clear that ahead of time, making sure that that interpreter or that bilingual individual doesn't step into that role at any point to explain any cultural instances, because they are not the expert on that. Again, as we said before, ensure that they do not know the parties and making sure asking where they are. Best practices too, if you're having a very long interrogation, think about team interpreting, where there's going to be 2 interpreters there, and this is especially necessary if you're interpreting somebody who's deaf and hard of hearing. But even in spoken language too, you want to make sure that there's at least 2 people if your interrogation or interview is going over an hour. Studies have shown that the mind starts to break down very soon after an hour or 2, and it can lead to inaccuracy when interpreting. If in many instances you can't find two interpreters, being sure that the interpreter is getting enough breaks during that interpretation too. Having that discussion in the pre-session, as we talked about before, so the interpreter knows, can let you know when she needs a break, he or she needs a break, so that they can continue to interpret throughout the length of the assignment needed.
So the good news is between Mike and I, we've done some of these things in our communities, and we are able to share a little bit about how we're dealing with some of the issues that are evolving in our communities. So I think I'm going to have Mike share a little bit about what Salem's doing first.
Okay, thanks, Shelley. Yeah, I mean, the first thing we did was acknowledge and recognize that this was something we needed to address and make it important to us as an agency. And we, in doing that, also included all of our community coordinated response and made sure that all of our working partners were on the same page with us and understood, Title VI and the executive order the way that we did and the reasons why we needed to do it. And one of the first things we did was bring in a nationally recognized instructor to actually train bilingual officers, staff, social service providers, several community members on how to be qualified interpreters. And I think in the end we ended up having somewhere around 54 or 55 qualified interpreters in 13 or 14 different languages. They went through a 2-day course. They also got assessments after that. And then all of the officers in charge on every single shift, and then all the other service providers in our coordinated response got a list of who we had available to us as qualified interpreters. And it's been really, really helpful. I'll tell you a quick example. Our IT guy for the police department speaks Mandarin, Vietnamese, and Chinese, as well as English. And he's like one of our stars as qualified interpreters go. We have a large population that meets that demographic, and it's been great to be able to have that person that we can call and get face-to-face interpretation. So we did that thing where we got those face-to-face interpreters qualified and available to us. We also entered into a contract with an over-the-phone interpretation service, and we, with the help, and again, a lot of this, actually all of this, it has been through the help of OVW and API, who actually assisted us a great deal in getting this training done. And we also entered into, like I said, this contract with an over-the-phone interpretation service. So anytime we have a situation where a qualified interpreter isn't available, we have a language that we don't have somebody available for face-to-face, we utilize that over-the-phone interpretation. We're trying right now, we're expected to acquire, as Wendy mentioned earlier, some audio-video inclusive interpreter stations, so that over-the-phone video interpretation that could also help us with sign language as well and address that portion of language access that we identified as a need. We are working on our policies. Again, all of this is it's a process, and we certainly don't feel like we're there where we want to be, but we've made some great steps along the way. And one of the things that we're really trying to make the best it can possibly be is our language access policy. We don't have an official policy rolled out yet. What we've done is we've had the chief and the executive officers put out memos that basically direct officers in charge, the supervisors, the detectives, anyone else that's involved in our response on what steps need to be taken. And as we're doing that and as we're learning and taking different pieces of what would be our policy and making them right, we're putting out these memos until we can put the full policy out. We have, like I said, a ton of collaboration with other service providers, and we've done a lot of work on trying to reach the immigrant population and the LEP community that's out there in our jurisdiction. And we've done a lot of community meetings. Just recently, just last week, I went to a church, and there was 200 plus LEP individuals that attend this church. It was a Brazilian church, and we had an interpreter in place, and myself and the chief and another investigator went there to talk and make it known what services we had available. And, we did also talk about our policies around undocumented victims report and that type of thing. So it's a whole big bunch of different things that are happening to get us to the point where we really feel that we're doing a good job in addressing Title VI, the executive order, and specifically the needs of the LEP individuals in our community. And Shelley, I know you're doing a ton of stuff there too. Actually, you've helped me with some of the stuff that we're doing here, so why don't you share a little bit of what you guys are doing?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is just remember that we don't have to reinvent the wheel here. There are so many stakeholders in our community that are already working with qualified and certified interpreters. Like I mentioned earlier, we reached out to the school system, the court system, the medical arena. We have refugee agencies, the Hispanic Cultural Center, even the LDS Church. We have a large Mormon population here in the Boise area, and many of the members of the church have been on missions and have continued to learn the language where they were sent. So we really tried to find the resources within the community, and then, like Mike said, assist them in becoming qualified interpreters. One of the things I'll tell you to be a little wary of is oftentimes people get a certificate for completing a class and they believe that that makes them certified. So just be a little wary of that and make sure that the interpreter that you're using is considered somebody who's qualified. Our department, again, we created the interpreter program and tried to work specifically within those communities to find languages that maybe were a little more difficult to get through the language line or something similar to that. We also, we have a refugee liaison with our department as well as an immigrant liaison. That has worked out wonderfully for us because I believe that the police have become a little bit more approachable. So once they do feel comfortable coming forward and reporting the crimes, we now have something in place to be able to take that report because we have the interpreters in place. So Mike and I both would do anything for you guys. If you are interested in any aspect of our programs, we're here to help you make this work in the best way it can for your community. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us.
Yes, and also API and NewApp, who again, you heard all the things that we were able to do in Salem, and it wouldn't have been possible without them, and obviously the support of OVW, who helped fund us with a grant program that's trying to address this need.
Yeah, I would like to echo that. You know, the work that we do with law enforcement, I definitely couldn't do without Mike and Shelley, and that teamwork and that collaboration between the advocates role, the TA providers role, and having law enforcement there is a really strong team when we're trying to do language access work. Language access is a process. You know, we're constantly thinking about new ways to be more effective, you writing the policy and making sure that it's updated too to make sure that it's useful for all the officers too. A language access plan that has gaps or doesn't work for many of the officers isn't a good language access plan. So thinking about how it's constantly revised to making sure everyone's jobs are easier is the best way to make sure that language access is addressing all types of gaps and barriers. Just a few more resources on language access. As Mike and Shelley said, we at the Asian Pacific Against Gender-Based Violence, as well as NEWAP, are TA providers that can help with any language access issues, resources, links to webinars. We have templates available that you can use to fill out any language access policy or plans. We also provide types of templates, I think survey assessments too on communities, so any information that you need in your work to help with language access advocacy. Another thing that I will mention is we've been working on a training for bilingual officers, very similar to what happened at Salem PD on interpretation, and we recently had that at San Francisco Police Department too. So training for bilingual officers on interpretation skills, and then also just interpretation skills. If you're thinking about building a community bank of any sort to help with your work, we can also help provide that interpretation skills building for bilingual individuals on proper interpretation so that they're helping in your community. That's NEWAP's contact. You can contact Rocio through that email address, and their web library has a lot of resources when it comes to language access and law enforcement, as well as particular issues as that involve victims of domestic violence. I think if you're interested in U visa or T visa issues, they also are included in that web library too. Breakdowns on policies that focus on interpretation of what DOJ is saying is a really great resource and things to read too if you're interested, and it can be found at the NEWAP library.
Yes, we also have our roundtable discussion that we hold, and you can see there's some information there for you to access that and get information on that. And it's a really good opportunity to just get together with your peers and talk about some of the issues, the challenges, and the solutions that are out there that have been put to good use around the country. So I think that brings us to the end of our presentation. I really hope that everybody picked up some good tools to help them address language access, and definitely, like we've said several times, make sure you reach out to everyone involved in this call with any assistance that you may need, technical assistance or information sharing. And I want to thank the Kansas Coalition and the Kansas Law Enforcement Academy, as well as NEWAP, API, and Shelley for making this possible and making it happen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.